Welcome back from lunch, everybody. I've got the task of trying to keep us all awake in the post-lunch dip. I'm Sarah Hall, Deputy Director, Anand, of UK and a Changing Europe and Professor of Economic Geography at the University of Nottingham. So I'm actually trained as a geographer, not an economist. I'll get that out now. I will take questions on Slido about colouring in and capital cities, but economics is what we're here to discuss. And we've got a great panel to do that. So I'm delighted to welcome Ben Chu, who's the economics editor of BBC Newsnight, and Gemma Tetlow, who's the chief economist at the Institute for Government, Jonathan Porters, a colleague, a senior fellow from UK and a Changing Europe, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. And joining us on Zoom is James Meadway, Director of the Progressive Economics Forum. And James, just give me a thumbs up that you can hear us. Great. So we're going to run this panel in a similar fashion to the previous one. So I've got some starters for 10 for the panelists, but I also have the iPad, which is where I would really encourage you to put your questions to the panelists, and we're using Slido to do that. And if you see questions that you're really passionate about and want to kind of push, then you can vote for those and they will come to the top of my list. So we'll make a start. So when I was preparing for this, I thought I'd go back through FT headlines 7 years ago to try and think about what was happening in the UK economy. And it's quite interesting. So at one level, it was really clear that the UK economy was recovering from the financial crisis and getting to grips with austerity. There were some headlines that foreshadowed some of the current debates that we're having, but in really different ways. So the FT had a story about the way in which globalization was fighting back aggressively, which was quite interesting, given questions today about deglobalization. By the time you get to May, and shortly before the referendum, references to Brexit become more prevalent. So there were references to whether it would trigger a DIY recession, and Treasury updates were in the news about households being £4,300 a year worse off by 2030. Growth would be 3.6% lower after 2 years, according to Treasury estimates. I think what's really startling, though, is that although kind of there were the seeds of the sort of Brexit change to the UK economy, on top of that and since then, and what obviously clearly isn't in those headlines, are the further shocks that the UK economy has witnessed subsequently, notably COVID and supply chain disruption, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a wider process of what you might think of as global reordering, the changing place of China, for example. So I wanted to start in that context by turning to each panellist and to ask you, what are the most striking differences for you between the UK economy then and now? And I'm going to start with Jonathan.
Okay, so I think probably I'd best sum this up. Like 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, Margaret Thatcher died. And I went on the Today programme the next morning to talk about her legacy, and I said this, I've got it here still. In 1979, a quarter of a century ago, a politician came to power with a radical agenda of market-oriented reform, a plan to reduce state control and release the country's pent-up economic dynamism. That changed the world, and we're still feeling the impact. His name, of course, was Deng Xiaoping. So what's changed, I think, is that in 2013, we were still living in Deng Xiaoping's world and Margaret Thatcher's. That is, we were still living in the sort of era of globalization and at least neoliberalism, if not full-scale Hayekian liberalism, because the penny hadn't dropped then, that actually something fundamental had changed, and that we were, post global financial crisis, we were in a new era where that approach could not be relied on either from a political or economic point of view to deliver either geopolitical stability or sustained, non-inflationary and reasonably consistent growth in productivity and living standards. We thought, even in 2013, I fully accept I was, just living in the past still then, hadn't clocked really that we were in this somewhat new era when things were going to be very different. So for me, the big changes, and I'm still struggling with it because I'm old and had been in economic policy already for a quarter of a century when at that point, I'm still struggling to reconcile myself to what the new era looks like. But it is pretty clear that we're not going back to that sort of that era. And the UK economy is still struggling to adjust. I'll stop there, I think.
Great. James, can I go to you next, please?
You can. You can hear me okay? Is that...
Yeah,
good.
that's good.
I realise I'm on a huge screen, which is slightly alarming for everybody. But just to pick up on what Jonathan said there, and I very largely agree with him, the big shift is this movement from a world in which people were still acting as if globalization was here to stay and this is how things will continue. And by now, of course, we really can't function like this. I mean, it was very striking, I think, to see the speech of Rachel Reeves a couple of weeks ago, going to Washington and making this very clear. There's, the figures from the right, in this case of the Labour Party, people who are the natural successors to one of the most sort of neoliberal politicians we've had, who's Tony Blair, the person who completed in many ways Margaret Thatcher's legacy in this country, going to Washington and saying globalisation as we know it has finished and this isn't coming back. So I think this is a quite dramatic change, at least in the perception of how the world is operating. And similarly, I think, again, agreeing with Jonathan, much of the tendencies were already there. That once you had the rise of China, once you had the tension that was starting to appear in that relationship at the core of globalization, really, between China and the US, and that very intense trade and debt relationship that had developed over a good long period of time there, once that started to get into some tension, as we saw after 2008 with China's continuing growth and much slower growth in the rest of the West, this was always going to, I think, end up something like the world we live in now, where there is a real serious turn across the Western world to forms of government intervention, most dramatically, I think, in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. But you can see the similar pressures now playing out inside the European Union with the, despite all the talk, at the time of Brexit, I remember state aid was the thing that, a reason to get out of the EU because we didn't want to have to abide by those state aid rules. Well, now you have the Commission talking about weakening these precisely in response to the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is a very dramatic, I think, change in how the world is operating and how major governments are responding to those changes.
Great, thank you. Gemma.
The advantage of writing things for public consumption is that you can go back and look at what you said in the past. Like Jonathan, I thought the question we were being posed was a 10-year look back, so that was what I did. 10 years ago, I was working for the IFS, so I looked back to what we wrote in our green budget of early 2013 to sort of see what were the issues that were on our minds and how similar or different are they to today. I have to say there were lots of similarities. I searched through the document and the word uncertainty appeared 58 times, which actually I think then was probably a lot less uncertain than things feel now, given the major shocks that have happened in the past decade. Some of the other puzzles and problems that were highlighted around the UK economy then are quite common to what I think we're still seeing today. Questions about why is productivity growth so weak? Why is business investment in the UK so weak? A picture of high employment being a bit of a puzzle and an unusual thing post-economic crisis in the UK compared to previous experiences. We were also at that point in the run-up to an election with a set of fiscal forecasts that suggested that the public finances were on a sustainable path, but very much predicated on some penciled-in, non-specific spending cuts coming in after the next general election. All of those things are quite similar to where we are today. But some things I think were different. It was notable from looking at that IFS Green budget that most of the big things that then hit the UK economy after that were not mentioned anywhere in that document at all. Not written by me, but written by our colleagues who'd done the macro forecast, sort of highlighting what are the biggest risks to the UK economy. They talked about a breakup of the Eurozone rather than the UK leaving the EU. And in terms of sort of public services outlook, I think at that point, as I say, there were similarities in the sense of being in the middle of a period of tight spending plans and penciling in more as a way of sort of hoping you get the public finances back on track. I think the big difference between then and now on public services was that back in 2013, there'd been a few years of public spending cuts, but broadly the performance of services was being held up, was holding up. There wasn't a huge amount of sign of problems there. And actually that sort of 2013, 2014 point, I think, is where you see a turning point in the performance of a lot of public services with, after that point, the performance starting to deteriorate, growing levels of violence in prisons, extending waiting lists in hospitals, more problems of delayed transfers of people into social care because of problems there. So I think where we are has changed quite a bit on that front as well.
Great, thank you. Ben.
Yeah. So my list of similarities and differences is probably more like Gemma's. Jonathan and James are much more big picture. Mine's a bit more parochial. But I mean, I would agree that, you know, the attitude to China, just on that point, back, 10 years ago, we were firmly in the golden era. You know, I did a piece for Newsnight looking back at some of the footage of that. And we had David Cameron going to China, I think it was just in 2010 to 2011, saying, we want more trade with China, the more the better. And it's really striking how that attitude has changed, quite amazing. Obviously Brexit, as Gemma mentioned, and it, looking back to the Cameron Osborne era, 10 years ago, they were really pretty committed to the single market. There was none of they weren't Eurosceptics at all. So that has utterly changed in sort of the policy front. I mean, it seems obvious to even state it, but inflation and interest rates, that's a very, very big difference from 2013. The base rate was, Bank of England's base rate was 0.5% then, and would go lower. Now, of course, we're talking about it topping out at 5.5%. I think the implications of that, people are talking about them, but they haven't economically hit home yet. House prices are now obviously even more unaffordable than they were. I think the ratio of house prices to earnings was about 6 times back in 2013. Now they're more like 8 times. Public services are much more overstretched, as Gemma was mentioning. On the similarities, I looked at the productivity growth for 2013, and it looks like it was kind of about the start of when it was starting to slow down. I agree with Jonathan, it wasn't obvious then that we were going into this long period where it would never recover. But actually in the data for that year, it was a fall. So that's a similarity, you could argue, on one level. 2013, we still had the debates about the banking crisis and solving the banks' lack of capital and fragility. We thought we'd solved that, but actually, with some of the stuff that's been happening more recently, maybe that isn't entirely solved. So you could argue that's a bit of a similarity. On austerity, I think there is some similarities in the sense that we've got very tight spending, as Gemma mentioned, rounds penciled in. But I think it's probably more of a difference in that it's not a policy so much. It's not held up as this our flagship policy. It's more a consequence of the choices that they're making. And that comes to the final similarity, which is that the Conservative Party is still hankering after tax cuts. And that does shape. That was true in 2013. It's true now, despite everything we've been through. And that does shape a lot of the way our politics and economics is going.
Great, thank you. So a question's come in on Slido which says, can you even differentiate between changes in the global economy when you've got COVID, Ukraine and Brexit in play? Surely the Brexit is overstated and global changes matter more. And that interests me because I think when I was thinking about how to structure this panel, one way would be to think about, Ukraine, and then have a sort of set of questions around COVID. Instead, we're actually going to look at different parts of the economy, and then for each of those, think about what the kind of driving forces of change are and what it might mean to be in the UK economy at the moment. And I thought it might make sense to start with households. So households at the moment are obviously kind of emblematic of some of the economic challenges that the UK is facing, particularly around inflation and the cost of living, but also around availability and affordability of housing and mortgage and interest rates, as Ben mentioned. So James, one of the things that really interests me is how the inflation situation in the UK and the cost of living crisis compares to other countries. There's some quite interesting figures from Spain. About 10 days ago, I think, they released their inflation figures quite early. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Because the questioner raises, I think, a very fair point, that disentangling UK-specific parts of everything we've been through in the last sort of, you can say 10 years, but really it's actually the last 4 years or so, from COVID onwards, well, from Brexit, then COVID, then the Ukraine war onwards, is quite difficult. There are some, fairly clearly by this point, some Brexit-related, Brexit-specific impacts. There's some impact on food prices from Brexit over the last few years. But what's really striking is exactly as the questioner says, is that there's this series of big global effects that are playing out, and the question really is, to what extent does an economy and its government respond effectively to those big global effects playing out? I mean, you mentioned Spain. One of the issues in Spain, of course, is actually relatively tight controls on price rises for things like rental prices and a few other elements that feed into the rate of inflation there. Now, this has been raised as a discussion in Britain, floated in the Telegraph a couple of weeks ago by the government, floating the idea that perhaps we might want to consider some form of regulation of prices of basic food products. And of course, as the inflationary surge plays out, and as we see shifting from energy, where we have introduced actually a degree of price control in common with the rest of Europe and much of the developed world, you start to see playing out also a demand for controls on the prices of basic food products, and some countries actually moving to introduce it. So I think Bulgaria is the most recent example there. France actually another month or so ago, a kind of voluntary system which the government here is also apparently considering. Now that's the political impact of this. I think looking ahead, the other bit is that Gemma mentioned uncertainty. The other bit that's really starting to factor now, in a way that 10 years ago wasn't quite the same sort of impact, is the way in which climate change and the shocks that this is inducing in the system, so the shocks of drought in Spain, for example, the shock to pressure on water, and the use of water across the world, which emerges in all sorts of really peculiar ways. Semiconductor manufacture, for example, in Taiwan, impacted by a drought a couple of years ago. This is starting to play through in ways that we're not really very well adapted to understand. This is an unusual new period in planetary history, never mind what we're doing with the economy. And that, I think, is going to be one of the challenges coming forward. Against this, Brexit, although serious for this country and has an impact, and mostly a negative impact by the looks of things, starts to look like relatively small beer.
So that leads us on to a question that's come through from Slido, which is, do you think that there could be a benefit economically to the UK from Brexit in the future? And if so, when? James, are you able to shed any light on that?
I mean, the way things have gone, it's one of those, like, if you stop banging your head against a wall, it starts to look better. It's got that sort of element to it. I mean, the bit that's coming up and underreported, I suppose, at the minute is that the existing trade and cooperation agreement is actually open for renegotiation at the end of 2025. So there is an opportunity there to decide that we didn't like at least some parts of it. So presumably, the way the polls look, it will be a new government and potentially one with a different mandate to do this. To look at that and adjust something and maybe try and get a better deal out of this. I mean, it has to be said, it's quite hard pushed, particularly, I suppose, coming from my kind of end of things, particularly once the European Union itself is saying things like, actually, the old idea of state aid and controls and subsidies and the rest of it, perhaps we're not going to be so strict about this in the future. It's really quite hard to tease out what exactly the advantage of Brexit is by this point, once that sort of political changes start to happen inside of Europe. So I'm afraid I can't particularly come up with a convincing argument as to why this will look good in the future, other than the fact we might be able to undo some of the damage that has been done in the past.
Great. I want to come to the TCA later on in the discussion, if that's okay. But if we move on then to another part of the economy that's been in the news quite a lot recently, and that's the question of immigration and the UK's labour market. So there's two elements here that really interest me. One is actually really helpfully summarised by a question on Slido, which I think is for Jonathan. What is the potential economic impact of immigration from the EU going down while immigration from outside of the EU goes up? So we've seen quite profound changes in the pattern of immigration to the UK. And then the second area of the UK's labour market that really interests me is kind of potentially longer term changes around an ageing population, the rates of potential workers out of work due to long-term sickness, and the implications of that for UK fiscal policy in particular when we're trying to stimulate growth. So if I could perhaps start with Jonathan on the question of migration.
Well, I think this follows on neatly from the previous one, because I think this is the one area where you can identify a clear, at least potential benefit of Brexit. Migration from the EU started falling almost immediately after the referendum and has fallen steadily since, and is now, net migration from the EU is now negative. Some of that is clearly Brexit, the direct and indirect psychological and legal effects of Brexit, but quite a lot of it would have happened anyway. Because of the fundamental economic and demographic drivers, which led first to very high immigration from the EU, were steadily falling away. So I think even without Brexit, we'd have seen quite a sharp fall off, and we certainly would not have been able to rely on the EU for workers in the same way as we had in the previous decade. And so Brexit, in that sense, contrary to other areas, has come at quite a providential time, because it provoked this loosening of restrictions to migration from outside the rest of the world. This equalization, this leveling up and leveling down of migration policy has led to a significant liberalization of immigration policy towards the rest of the world. And that in turn means that last year we more than made up for the fall in migration from the EU by increased migration from outside the EU. So Brexit really has helped in the aggregate terms, and it's also, I think, although the impact of this will be slower to come through, probably helped at the sort of micro level, in the sense that the other aspect of the new system is it's more heavily biased towards higher skilled and higher paid workers. The nature of the new system is that it's very hard to get a visa for a low skilled or low paid job, with the exception of the care sector, but it's quite a lot easier to get a visa for a medium or high skilled job paying medium or high pay. And all other things being equal, and there's a lot of complications there, that's probably going to be economically beneficial over the long term. So I think, that in that sense, the jury is out, and there are clearly downsides to the new system as well, particularly for some specific sectors. But overall, there's a much better case to argue that that immigration is going to be a net benefit for Brexit than almost any other area of policy, if, and it's a big if, the politicians can hold their nerve and stick with the broadly sensible policy which they've introduced. And as I said a number of times, I think, it is it is sort of both hilarious and sort of deeply bizarre that politicians on both sides are shouting at each other about how, including the ones who are responsible for the system, are shouting at each other about what a failure the immigration system is, when in contrast to almost any other area of British public policy, where we see a series of multiple car crashes, immigration policy is actually functioning relatively well. On the sort of labour market and sickness and disability, it's very hard to tell because the data is such a mess, but I do think there is a real risk of repeating the mistakes of the 1990s, when we had, in retrospect now, the 92 to 97 Conservative government, the major government, is viewed as a political car crash, of course, but also a relatively successful in terms of macroeconomic and economic policy management. And I think on the whole that's not unfair. The one big exception was that they did allow a huge rise in the number of people going on to disability benefits and exiting the workforce, and did almost nothing about it because it was politically convenient not to do so. And it would be a terrible mistake to do that again.
Great, thank you. Gemma, can I ask for your thoughts on the so-called Great Resignation and issues of labour market participation more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you raised the question about population ageing and what this means. Actually, pre-pandemic, we'd had a period of actually very successful sets of policies and other social changes that were increasing employment rates of older workers, and those had gone up quite a lot. That was probably anyway going to stall because we'd done the increase in the female state pension age and the increase in the male state pension age, and not more of that wasn't coming through, so we're probably going to see a bit more of a stabilisation of those trends. But the pandemic, as Jonathan's been alluding to, sort of pushed that into reverse, with a large number of people taking early retirement during the pandemic. Now, I think a lot of the evidence data suggests that a lot of people who of that older cohort who left the labour market during the pandemic, it seems to be more early retirement financially driven rather than people moving on to reporting being long-term sick. In the budget, the Chancellor clearly did try and do some things to try and encourage some of those people back in. I'm a bit sceptical about how much the government can really do if people went through the pandemic, reassessed their life choices, thought that they actually didn't really want to spend all their hours of the day in the office and felt they were financially secure enough to take early retirement. It seems quite hard for the government to turn that around. I think one important question is that a longer term trend that subsequent cohorts are also going to want to retire earlier, or is it really a one-off thing for that pandemic cohort? One reason I think it could be more of a one-off is that the pension provisions of successive cohorts are getting somewhat worse and worse as fewer people have defined benefit schemes. So I think actually cohorts coming through, the silver lining to poorer pension provision may be more incentive to carry on working, which is not much of a silver lining. But
I was feeling quite helpful that you were talking about the older cohort and being very clear that no one on the panel was part of that. So I was feeling quite good until you started talking about changing pension provision, and then things started to change a bit in my mind. Ben, did you want to come in on
Yeah,
that?
I mean, Jonathan's written and talked a lot in the past about the sort of the productivity gains of immigration that it can bring, productivity growth gains, not just output per capita. But I think it's interesting in the current context to think about what the implications would be of not having had these levels of migration in recent years. We did an interview on Newsnight with Geeta Gopinath, who's the number 2 at the International Monetary Fund, and we said, what's the fund's view about the UK's position with 600,000 net migration? And her response was that actually that's probably helped, in her view, to keep inflation down relative to where it would have been. We've got a very tight labour market. You can assume that if we hadn't had that level of net migration, we would have had an even tighter one. And her view is that would have helped pushed up inflation in the UK even more, which I think intuitively feels. Well, they're not all working, of course, but it intuitively feels right that they are filling gaps in the labour market. And yeah, absent those flows, we might have had an even worse problem. But I don't know if, Jonathan, do you agree with that? I was quite interested in your perspective.
I agree. I mean, other things being equal, and in particular, I think the rise, it's clear that quite a lot of people who didn't come in on work visas are now working, whether they are Ukrainians or from Hong Kong, or whether they are the dependents of people who come on work or study visas. And that certainly has taken some of the pressure off, and I think you could see that in some of the recent slackening of the labour market. But a lot of the work visas, of course, have gone to people in the health and care sector. So there, I think what's happening is not so much reducing inflation, but simply preventing services that were already under are still under a huge amount of strain from imploding completely. It's hard to imagine where we'd be in the NHS now if we didn't have those extra foreign doctors and nurses, and indeed in the social care sector if we didn't have an extra 60 or 70,000 people from outside the EU in the last year alone.
Great. James, did you want to add anything to this?
Only that it's always a bit challenging to say, well, immigration is good because it's going to bring wages down and therefore bring inflation down. I think you can go backwards and forwards on the size of the impact that plays out there. The bit that's striking at the minute is that the inflationary impact we've had over the last sort of 18 months or so is not really associated with what's happened in the labour market. This has come from huge external factors, and those would still be there regardless of what's happening with immigration. So whether you shave off 1 or 2% on inflation because you've had 600,000 people turn up, I think it's slightly more moot point once you have an inflationary surge from COVID, from the Ukraine war, from various issues that have appeared in food supply over the last year or so. And again, I think it's a symptom of the kind of economy that we're moving into now, just subject to slightly more erratic shocks than we've been used to in the past, and that's what we're going to have to get used to.
Great. So we're going to move on to another part of the economy now. We're going to take a look at business and firms. So the thing that really interests me here is a paradox, really, that the trade and cooperation agreement, you could argue, delivers more on EU strategic interests in goods than it does for the UK on its strategic interests in services. And yet actually in the UK we've seen the figures on services look like services are holding up more strongly than goods. And then the picture gets even more complicated and, to my mind, interesting. I'm a geographer. That this isn't playing out evenly across the UK. So when you look at the way in which London and the South East is performing compared to other parts of the UK, I think there's some interesting trends there. And this brings us back to the point that Ben made about how maybe 10 years ago we were at the start of this sort of flatlining and decline in productivity. And that's really intensified. So for me, you've got this sort of long-run change in productivity being overlaid by the impacts of, a new trading arrangement with our the UK's nearest trading partner. Gemma, I was just wondering if you could maybe start by fleshing out a little bit about what this looks like regionally and across the Devolve.
Sure. I mean, I guess the regional picture in the UK is that we have had long-standing regional differences in productivity and output. That actually had somewhat reversed through the pandemic period, where London and the South East did relatively worse than some other parts of the country. But in terms of the sort of Brexit impact between London, the South East and other parts of the country, it reminds me of one of the pre-Brexit happening, there was various different economic modelling efforts going on to try and look at the regional potential impact of Brexit. And actually some of those came up with very different answers. And one of the reasons for that was depending on whether or not you thought London's economy was nimble enough to adjust to other things. So sort of the first round effect of Brexit, given what you said about the less openness on services and better on goods, you would expect that London and the South East would have been relatively hard hit by Brexit compared to perhaps more other manufacturing parts of the country. But some people, I think, including Jonathan's colleagues, CEP analysis, I think, suggested London and South East would actually do okay, and that was because they assumed, as in the past, that London would reorient its efforts to where the potential were. And I guess part of the question that will play out over the next few years is the extent to which different economies and different workforces are flexible as new opportunities open up, old opportunities close down. And that comes back to Jonathan's sort of earlier allusion to the 1980s experience of when industries shut down in some parts of the country and some areas ended up just languishing and people not reallocating to other things. But I think it's probably what really is going to matter for regional economic growth in the UK. Partly it will depend on what's going on in the rest of the world and our global trading agreements, but it's been one of those really long-standing problems in the UK. Lots of governments have identified wanting to boost regional economic growth, and there's probably an awful lot that could be improved within UK policy making before we even worry about the changes that are going on with our trading arrangements elsewhere to provide greater clarity and certainty about policy that might encourage business investment and sort of getting the levelling up agenda and sort of, I think, pretty cross-party consensus now towards a desire for more devolution of powers is great, but getting that right will really matter. Doing that in a way that's most effective and does generate greatest potential will matter.
Great. I'm going to come to Jonathan and Ben. I want to spend a bit of time thinking a bit more about the UK's relationship with the EU. And I think there's maybe two elements of this which are interesting. So one, and it's already cropped up, is the scheduled review of the TCA. And I think that's doing quite a bit of heavy lifting at the moment in terms of, what might be available to the UK. My understanding is that it's for the UK and the EU to determine what that review looks like, and it's envisaged to be more of a technical review rather than an opportunity for the UK to explore things that it doesn't like or doesn't think is working as well as it could, as we heard earlier this morning. So I think sort of your ideas around what might be available in any kind of future TCA. And then the other part of the relationship with the EU that really interests me is, is the UK being caught out or caught between the sort of IRA in the USA and green industrial policy in the EU, and where does that leave the UK? And then there's a really interesting question that's just popped up on Slido, actually, which is, we often talk about what a TCA revision might bring, how that might bring benefits to the UK, but what benefits could any review or closer integration between the UK and the EU bring to the EU, which I think is quite an interesting way of thinking about it. Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Well, I guess the reason that the TCA is a sort of obvious focus of interest is the timing, right? Yes, it's supposed to be a technical review, but the fact is that we will have an election sometime in 2024, or perhaps at the latest early 2025, and so there may be an opportunity for a new or refreshed government to adopt a different approach. So I think that it's a sort of happy coincidence of timing. If the TCA were being reviewed now, it would probably just be a sort of technical smoothing out exercise. The option is at least open, I think, because of the political calendar, to do something a bit more serious if both sides want it. So the question is, what's in it for both sides? And can they make it work politically? And of course, we don't know that yet, because that's 18 months away and a lot of things will happen politically between then and now. It's quite clear that there are, of course there are large potential benefits to both sides from changing things, because there are large actual costs to Brexit in terms of the disruption to the trading relationship. So obviously, reversing some of those would yield significant economic benefits to us, but also to the EU. And in a context when, and this goes on to the one part of your question, which is what are we losing by being outside the major trading blocs? Well, we clearly Anand and I have an article in the Times Red Box tomorrow morning on this, making this point precisely, that this isn't a great time to choose to be outside the three major trading blocs of the world, but we have done that, and that is rather more, it's rather more awkward doing that now than it would have been in the previous more liberal international order. And so getting back inside the EU one, at least in part, would benefit us, would also benefit the EU, because the size of the bloc does matter, and we are a lot smaller than the EU, but we're not negligible in size. It's not like the EU's relationship with Serbia or whatever. We would make a material difference. So they're clearly, now what is possible given the political constraints, particularly the political constraints on our side and the legal constraints, particularly the legal constraints on the EU side, we don't know yet. They range all the way from sort of things like the UK agreeing to some form of alignment on health and safety and food and so on, which would certainly ease trade but isn't going to be economically transformative, to some sort of new version of Theresa May's deal, which would at least partially get us back into the regulatory and customs framework. But as I say, I think that the potential is there, but whether the political stars will align remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I agree. I mean, short of going back into the single market and customs union, which of course Labour has said we're not going to do, and there are very obvious political and structural obstacles to that happening. And UK and EU did a really great document, I think, a few months ago, looking at some of the areas you can do, some of the things you can do, just from memory. Jonathan mentioned food safety, obviously the horizon and the science cooperation, something that could be done, musicians touring, data sharing, energy market integration, various things on finance. So there's that was a really useful document. I'd encourage you all to read it, because it's things that can practically be done. And just to make another point, which is that, remember the Windsor framework, a lot of the things that are in there were the things which, hard Brexiteers were saying, why can't the EU just do this 3 or 4 years ago? And it turns out they could do that, but that's because the whole political environment, the rhetoric and the sense of trust was back. So I think that what that does show is that even within the strictures of not being in the single market and customs union, there is leeway as long as the political mood music is right. So I think that should be relatively encouraging.
Great. This is looking good, because my top ranked question by a significant margin is, what are the most important things to focus on the TCA? And Ben has just done a great job of plugging work by UK Interchange Euro. And I didn't know about Jonathan and Alan's Times Red Box piece, so I've managed to cover that as well. So that's great. James, did you have anything that you wanted to particularly emphasise around these questions of productivity and firm and sector implications?
I suppose there's the other way to cut the productivity problem, and it's one that I think may become more apparent over the next few years. possibly already is becoming somewhat apparent, which is the average productivity in Britain looks bad, and has looked quite bad for some period of time relative to sort of obvious peers. The spread and the distribution can look quite good. There are some exceptionally productive firms out there, manufacturing firms and financial services and this sort of thing, and then an enormous long tail of much less productive firms. Now, one reason you might think that these firms are so productive is because they are internationally facing, they're heavily involved in trades, they are forced to be productive because of that heavy export orientation, and things that damage this, you'd anticipate to start to knock off that productivity and gains from productivity from their openness to trade. So potentially there's not so much the effect on the average. I mean, most firms don't actually trade that much in Britain, like other countries, the same sort of thing. It's the impact to the top end that I think probably causes the most concern in terms of any productivity losses coming from Brexit over the next few years.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting data out there as well around this kind of the place of UK provincial cities in the productivity question, and how they seem to be underperforming compared to their peers in Europe and North America. So I think there's a really interesting city angle to this as well. So moving on, if we think about the economy going forward and in the context that we're in, Ben, can I maybe start with you to think about where you see the big opportunities for UK PLC?
Yeah.
And where some of the challenges
Yeah, well, I'll start with the challenges because we've already touched on it. You know, the world, I mean, it is interesting to go back to 2015, 2016, and some of the arguments for Brexit about this global Britain vision. I looked up a piece by David Davis, and he was saying, we will not only do a trade deal with the US after Brexit, we will do a trade deal with China. You know, this was the promise, this was the global Britain. We will trade with everybody, we'll do trade deals with everybody, it'll be a great boom. And, you know, David Davis, ironically, is now one of the biggest hawks on China, saying we should get it out of all parts of the UK, lots of parts of the UK economy. So that just shows you how things have shifted. And that just articulates the fundamental problem which with global Britain is that the world around Britain has changed massively since 2016. The US hostility to China, regarding it not just as a competitor but actually a challenge to be thwarted, that's hugely significant. We've seen what's happened with semiconductors. They're putting pressure on their allies in Japan and the Netherlands and also the UK to get to not trade with China in certain key sectors. Really, really important. And the US trade deal, what we confirmed by the Downing Street last week, I think it was, that's just not on the table as far as the US is concerned. So that element has gone. So I think there is a fundamental challenge there for that post-Brexit global Britain vision, which was not anticipated, let's put it that way, back in 2016. And then in practical terms, you have obviously this subsidy race. You know, China, the US, the EU in response, they're all putting huge amounts of money in various different ways into subsidizing domestic semiconductors, green energy. It really is a race, and that has massive implications for the UK in terms of the danger that globally mobile companies will move to those places where they can avail themselves of those subsidies. That's what they are telling Downing Street. You know, why would we invest in the UK when we can get these subsidies in the US? That's a really big challenge for the UK, because obviously it doesn't have the firepower to compete with those two huge blocks, the US and the EU. And obviously China has a huge amount, always been subsidizing its global companies for decades now. So how do we nimbly maximize our potential in that environment? That is a very, very key challenge. Obviously Labour has I've tried to articulate an answer. The government is trying to do it as well, but I think there's a big space to be filled in, and I'm not sure things like the semiconductor strategy really answered that, although it was well received, in fairness, by the industry. I mean, and I suppose that brings us to some of the opportunities. I mean, you do speak to people in the sector, and they do say, look, the UK has a great science base. This is where the potential is. Things like niche areas of semiconductors, compound semiconductors, where we do have a really great research base. That's the way to focus your resources rather than going for the mass scale production of chips. And obviously ARM is UK based. So there's various nimble targeted subsidies seems to be the opportunity that people talk about. Renewables, I mean, we hear Rishi Sunak saying, you know, we have a global lead on renewables. Well, we do in terms of generation. I don't think we actually have a great lead on the technology and the manufacturing of renewables. So it's not to discount it, but I think a bit of a reality check is probably in order there. AI, well, I mean, that was talked up until a few months ago. It's this great post-Brexit opportunity. The white paper was full of it. We can use this opportunity of Brexit to be nimbler on innovation and less heavy-handed was the specific words they used as well. Now, as we've all seen with the rise of ChatGPT and the existential threat headlines, that doesn't seem to be the consensus anymore, that being loose on regulation is a sensible thing to be doing. And so Rishi Sunak and the government have started to pivot to sort of from saying we will have a laxer environment and get more investment that way, to us being the sort of the capital of regulation, hopefully, making the UK an honest broker and base for it there. So potentially so, but I think it is worth noting how much the rhetoric and the strategy have changed in only a few months.
I think that's really interesting around, one potential opportunity that might be put forward for the UK is that it becomes a kind of global leader or arbiter in regulation. And you've seen that in government. It's also actually coming through in our questions quite a lot around, could the UK look to kind of deliver Brexit dividends through regulatory flexibility? We heard that this morning. Could it regulate more akin to a kind of quasi-offshore type economy like Luxembourg or Ireland? So I just wondered if I could push you a bit more on the sort of, we see this today with Sunak and his trip to America. Is the UK in a position where it can offer regulatory leadership internationally?
Well, I mean, the argument against Brexit in many ways was that the EU is a regulatory superpower and that, companies like investing in the UK in the single market because it's part of that regulatory umbrella. So I don't think it's as simple as saying we can just make ourselves a regulatory capital if you're not part of that market. I mean, I think there possibly are opportunities there, but I wouldn't exaggerate them. And this may be an area where, if the UK becomes closer to the EU in regulation, that reality of being a global hub for it becomes more realistic than sort of going on our own path.
Great. Jonathan, what do you see as the big opportunities or challenges for the UK going forward?
Well, I agree with pretty much everything Ben said. I mean, I think the obvious potential opportunity, which relates back to what I was saying about immigration before, is India, which is the one where, unlike the US and China, a trade deal is more rather than less likely relative to what we thought after Brexit, when most of us were saying, trade deals with India never ever happen. Regardless of, now, the trade deal with India in itself will actually not change very much because it will be relatively, it won't cover that much stuff. It won't really change the fundamentals that much. But the potential for the UK-India relationship does look, India is one of the few countries that isn't going to suffer from severe demographic decline in the short to medium term. It has a huge reservoir of skilled people. Its connections with the UK are obviously historic connections, but its current business and people connections are growing rapidly. And it is the fastest growing large economy in the world by some measure at the moment. Now, there are lots of issues and problems with India, its polity and economy, of course. But nonetheless, I think that's something where one could be reasonably somewhat more optimistic about the prospects for global Britain than we were 5 years ago, in contrast to almost everything else.
Great. James, can I come to you for the same question, please?
Yeah, I'd add to that, I suppose, and unfortunately I'm drawn back inevitably to the challenges. The one that sort of comes through in particular is that if we are going to try and think about what global Britain might be like and how you might make the most of some of the opportunities that do potentially exist, is that much of this involves having a state and having a government with the ability to focus on those things and deliver an industrial strategy that works, and to build up the relationships with suppliers and manufacturers and the rest of it that actually hasn't really happened in this country for a very, very long period of time, and quite intentionally so. It was a deliberate part of policy to not have that kind of long-term relationship between government and between industry and direct support and subsidy and all the rest of it, is that we don't really have the capacity in government necessarily to move quickly into a world that looks like this. So you have, for instance, the Labour Party quite clearly talking along these lines and wanting to do this. The capacity to deliver that in government isn't necessarily there. This seems to be at least part of the problem just in the pandemic with procuring PPE. That you had government departments that simply did not know who the manufacturers were. That institutional knowledge wasn't there to go off and find who the best suppliers were. So you end up with this dog's dinner, really, that we got over 2020 into 2021. So that, I think, is quite a significant challenge, and one that I don't quite see the politics in Britain working in favour of really solving it. That we want more civil servants, we want them to be better trained. Instead, this rhetoric of the blob and all the rest of it that we get at the minute. And that, I think, is a lurking problem for any version of global Britain, where we start thinking about, okay, what are the opportunities we have? Well, actually reaching those opportunities, I think, is going to be extremely difficult for this country now.
Great, thank you. And Gemma?
So, add one thing on the discussion of trade deals, then make one more parochial point. On the trade deals, I do think one thing that may need to be brought out more kind of explicitly in the public debate and for politicians to tackle head on in terms of thinking about what we can get in global trade deals and what we're willing to trade off is two things are probably going to be controversial in potential future trade deals. One is agriculture and the other is immigration and visa access. There's a particular issue with the India trade deal. And so I think having a more upfront discussion about what do the UK public want, to what extent are they willing to trade off perhaps some hit on our agricultural sector, greater access to our labour market in return for opportunities overseas may have to come a bit more front and centre in getting opportunities there. The more parochial point, I think, in terms of opportunities for the UK economy would be to come back to the point that you raised earlier around the performance of our second cities. In terms of boosting overall UK economic growth, if you could bring up the output and productivity of the parts of the country that are currently performing less well, that would go quite a long way to boosting prosperity overall. So getting the levelling up agenda, whatever you want to call it, right, will be quite key. One of the major problems in that area has been the degree of churn in government policy, not only between different governments, but also the same governments changing their mind about how to do that. So I think we do need some longevity of the policies in that area. There are some positive signs so far in the sense that the current government's levelling up agenda is probably focusing on the right types of policies to devolve to boost growth, so things like skills, infrastructure, innovation policies are where there is evidence that those sorts of things can make a difference. So that's positive, but it will require some sort of long-term focused effort, consistency, and it's welcome that if the new Trailblazer deals are exploring things like giving bigger, less ring-fenced budgets to local areas to help them take advantage of some of the possibilities that are there for devolution, getting synergies between different policies in our local area. But there's various things you need to get right to really make that work.
And can I push you a bit on what the policy levers are that you think would be most valuable for those cities? So you've mentioned Trailblazer deals. Just for the audience, these are kind of enhanced devolution deals essentially for Greater Manchester and the West Midlands.
Yes.
What sort of policy levers would you be looking at?
So we did a bit of a review of the evidence on what works, and the things that we picked out there were transport policy is important, but particularly improving the connections into and around cities as being perhaps where the biggest bang for your buck could be. Skills policies, this is higher level but not university level education, coordinating, kind of matching that up in the local areas to the needs of businesses that are there or want to set up there. As I say, innovation policy, also some potential there. So probably there I'd distinguish between there's R&D spending on sort of basic science, which is probably something that central government needs to do. We don't need every part of the UK having its own basic science research programme, but there are some more sort of later stage innovation policies, kind of taking that to market, getting that into businesses, which would make sense to have more control over that in local areas to match that up to the business needs.
Great. So to wrap this up, I'm going to pose the same question to each panellist, which would be your key primary economic policy intervention that you would make to try and address some of the challenges you've identified in the discussion. I'm going to start with Jonathan.
I think the sort of obvious ones are around housing and transport infrastructure, and addressing the problem that we don't, that we don't build stuff anymore in this country because it's the planning system and other essentially political barriers to building stuff are just too great. Unfortunately, I don't think I have any more idea than anyone else about exactly how you do that. It's some combination of brute political will and clever incentives to buy off, the sort of more reasonable local opposition or obstacles to that. But that does seem to, I think, for those who haven't read it, the Ed Balls and Anna Stansbury paper on sort of obstacles to regional growth, I think makes a quite convincing case as to what the problem is, and equally importantly what the problem is not. And I think that the availability of the lack of transport infrastructure in particular in the north, and the lack of the ability to build housing, particularly in around London and its surrounding area and other places where there is excess demand, do seem to me to stand out as the sort of problems that government ought to be able to do something about.
Great. Ben?
Well, it's a bit of a cop-out. I mean, obviously you say housing, transport, and then you say, what about education skills? You go down the list and they're all important. So I would probably say, as a cop-out answer, that having a kind of industrial strategy, a mission-based industrial strategy, which encompasses all of them, and all those subsidiary policies flow from that and are framed in the basis of what you want to do nationally in terms of industrial policy. And that can include levelling up, that can include skills, that can include housing, it can include transport, but they're all through that prism. I think getting that and in a sort of self-confident way about clearly articulating what you want to achieve in terms of government policy, I think that's probably the key step change that we would be recommended.
James, I can see you nodding. What would your selection be?
Well, I think that's set me sort of thinking, if you had to do one thing, perhaps buy arm would be the thing to do. That, if you want to do industrial strategy and you want to have a national champion, it is sitting there in front of you as a genuinely world-leading technology company. That at the minute we're just casually, how many, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, gave it away to SoftBank. Now it's going to go up and list presumably on the New York Stock Exchange. Why not take a golden share? Why not use that as the building block for an intervention in the semiconductor manufacturing, semiconductor industry, and use it as the start of developing a genuine industrial strategy around that?
Great. And Gemma, the final word.
I mean, I think my answer would be similar to Ben's. It does seem that one of the key things that's been undermining business investment in the UK, which has been one of the big reasons for weak productivity growth in the UK, has been a lack of certainty over the last decade for a succession of reasons. And tackling that as much as offering tax incentives or anything else to businesses to set up here, I think is really key. And as Ben said, I think from that flows tackling individual frictions in the system. And one of the things that's become quite clear in the last year or so is when it comes to building new infrastructure for green renewable energy generation, is how long it takes to get new connections to the national grid. It's all these little micro problems that you don't realise but do need someone at the top to kind of have a clear strategy, say that this matters, and then from that flows all that action.
Great. Thank you very much to the panellists for a really wide-ranging discussion. And thank you to the audience. We're going to take a half-hour break now, and then my colleague Paula Surridge will be chairing the next session, I believe. So thank you very much.